All right, gang. So today's going to be the last episode of the Cold War, and the last thing we're going to mention on the Cold War. So, what I do want to talk about real briefly is the end of the Cold War and the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union. Well, beginning in the 1980s, what began to happen, as what happens with most communist economies, is that their economy slows down. The country cannot produce enough goods for its consumer goods for its people, and people begin to get frustrated with that. And our discussion is going to center around two people. The first of these is a guy named Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev was the head of the Soviet Union from 1985 to 1991. Mikhail Gorbachev was a different kind of leader, and here's what he did that was different. He had two policies that were really different than those that came before him. And the first one is called Glasnost. Glasnost symboled a period of interaction and cooperation and openness with the United States and the European countries. Essentially what this was in terms of foreign policy, he would be very clear and distinct on what they were doing, and they would share information with each other. Well, the second was an economic policy that he believed in, and this was Perestroika. Perestroika was the restructuring of the Soviet economy, and Perestroika began to allow a little bit of capitalism and a little bit of free market enterprise between farmers and small-time businessmen that would allow them to hopefully grow the economy. Now, eventually what happened was this amount of freedom began to spill over, and they wanted more political freedom. They wanted more say in their government. Excuse me. And what eventually happened is the economy totally collapsed. But what Gorbachev was able to do was he led to a relatively peaceful transition at the end of the Soviet Union. He led to a peaceful collapse. Most of the collapsing of the Soviet Union and of the communist countries that took place in the late 80s was relatively peaceful. There wasn't major fighting, major wars to end communism. It just sort of withered away and went away. Well, the second major person we're going to talk about is from Great Britain. And the primary leader that we're going to discuss in Great Britain is Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher was the British Prime Minister from 1979 and 1990. Now, she had a very close relationship with the American President Ronald Reagan. Now, Ronald Reagan wasn't elected until 1980. Ronald Reagan then went out of office in 1988. But her relationship to him was very close, and a lot of their policies were very similar to one another. For example, free trade and less government. Both Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher both believed in free market enterprise, free trade within their country, and less government intervention, a smaller government. In fact, in her last speech to the British House of Commons, when she spoke to them, she warned their country against the dangers of socialism. She essentially accused the new government that was taking over of being in favor of socialism, and she did not like that at all. She even asserted their foreign policy. She even asserted their foreign policy and their military might in a war with Argentina to take over the Falkland Islands, or to reassert their claim over the Falkland Islands. And that took place in the 1980s as well. Well, not only did these two leaders kind of lead the edge of Soviet economics and the collapse of communism in Soviet Russia, or the USSR, but what happened in the late 80s is there was a surge of nationalism in the Warsaw Pact countries. They grew frustrated with having to take orders all the time from the Soviet Union and having to do lockstep and essentially do what they wanted them to do. And so what happened in 1989 is there was a series of what are called velvet revolutions. And the velvet revolutions were smooth. If you think of velvet and how it's soft to the touch, these were smooth revolutions that led to the end of communism in Poland, and to the end of communism in Czechoslovakia. And it really marked the transition from communist government to peaceful democratic governments that we have today. Well, in 1989, also the Berlin Wall was torn down. There was, again, lots of feelings of nationalism beginning to surge. Lots of Germans began to want to reunite with their East and West Germans wanted to reunite. And it really came to a head when Ronald Reagan went and gave a speech in front of the Berlin Wall on the West Berlin side. And Ronald Reagan essentially said, he looked at Gorbachev and he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." He didn't actually look at him. It was part of his speech. And essentially what he was saying was, Gorbachev, you need to negotiate with us. You need to to be more friendly with us. And Ronald Reagan had a very hardline stance against communism. He believed that the U.S. that communism was morally inferior, was morally wrong, and he attacked that and went on it and attacked it on that premise. Okay, well, eventually, what this led to, not just because of Ronald Reagan, obviously, but because the German people were tired of being disunited, and as you'll see in the story that we watched today, the Berlin Wall was torn down in 1989, and it sort of just, again, withered away. Communism just kind of withered away. And so the Berlin Wall was torn down, and East and West Germany were formally reunited in 1990. Well, also happening in 1990 was the formal breakup of the USSR. If you'll remember, the Soviet Union expanded greatly, or Russia expanded greatly, and took in countries and made them part of a federation. And this federation or federal government fell apart, particularly the ones in Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Ukraine fell apart. Belarus was part of the Soviet Union, and they found their independence and gained their independence in 1990. So now they are new and independent countries free of Soviet influence. Well, as the Soviet Union collapses, what we begin to see is the expansion of NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization begins to expand into these newly democratic countries and saying, hey, we're going to help them, and we're going to move on, and we're going to take some land, and we're going to bring other countries into our fold. NATO has expanded into Turkey. NATO has expanded into other European countries, Eastern European countries now. And so what has happened is NATO has greatly expanded, and that kind of marked the end of the Cold War with the collapse of communism, the leadership of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan on the side of the non-communist, the capitalist countries, and nationalism in the Warsaw Pact countries, and then the Berlin Wall falling down, are all part of the end of the Cold War. All right? I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.